happen to that specific player that could either boost their production or hurt their production, and then also diving into their injury history to know what risks are associated with drafting that pick, so that way you can make sure that you are not drafting too many risky players. You don't want to have a super risky team. It's just setting you up to be completely disappointed. You may have maximum upside, but that upside comes with a lot of risk. So the best strategy is always balancing your draft picks by focusing on creating a roster that has that week winning type of upside, but also won't completely tank if you hit the wrong side of variance. Another important factor, it's knowing your league. And what that means is knowing who your opponents are, what their draft tendencies are, and by doing that, you can always find value. And year over year, you're going to see the same trends continue if you're in the same league. Certain players go off the board early. I know me personally, some of my leagues, quarterbacks just fly off the board early. All the tight ends go early in other leagues. And then in one of my more seasoned leagues, we have great quarterbacks going off the board in the 6th, 7th, and 8th round, where they normally go off the board in the 4th and 5th rounds. So knowing your league, knowing your opponents, it's a major factor, which brings me to my next point: confirm your league settings. If it's a 2-quarterback league, you need to target a quarterback early. If it's standard, you know running backs are inflated. Touchdowns are also king. There are a handful of players whose value can dramatically change based on the scoring setting. Someone like Julian Edelman, Golden Tate, and Jarvis Landry are PPR monsters, but in standard, they are very overvalued, and come draft day, they're always being taken too high. Now, if you're in a league that has more bonuses for those big plays, then just bump up those players who are more deep threats. Those guys like Tyreek Hill and Robbie Anderson. So just overall, make sure you're making an adjustment based on your scoring settings in your rankings. Now, most importantly, out of all of these things, you have to mock draft at every position. You're not going to know how you can construct your team unless you're doing these mock drafts. And if you don't know where you're drafting from, just make sure to mock draft in every spot. The draft spot that you have has a major impact on who you're able to choose from, especially in the early rounds. If you have a top 4 pick, for example, you're not going to be able to land somebody like Fournette or Melvin Gordon. And if you have a back end pick, you can't possibly expect to land someone like Antonio Brown, Ezekiel Elliott, or any of the other 3 stud running backs. As you get deeper into the draft, you still should be able to land your major targets, but as for the beginning of the draft, you're only going to have a limited player pool to choose from depending on what spot you get. So make sure you're able to mock from several different positions and that you're flexible no matter what position is given to you on draft day. But moving on, the next item on this list is buying in too much on analyst hype or preseason hype. You got to do your own research. So I'm going to start with this example and tell me which one of these 2 running backs that you want to own on your team this year. So we have running back 1. Running back 1 is the only running back in the NFL with 1,200 plus scrimmage yards, with 30 plus receptions and 6 touchdowns in each of the past 2 seasons. The only one in the NFL to do that. This same running back has also finished as a top 18 fantasy RB in each of the past 4 seasons, including 2 top 10 finishes. And then we're going to tack on the final stat that this player played in 78 of a possible 80 games in the past 5 seasons, so you know he's going to be available for your team, and predicting an injury for this player would just be silly just based on his past history over the last 5 years. So that's RB1. Now RB2. Tell me if you guys want to draft this guy instead. And RB2 has seen declines in rushing efficiency for 4 straight seasons. He's coming off a season where he had the least amount of rushing touchdowns in his career since he was being a starter, and scored just 1 rushing touchdown in his last 5 games, and has not had a 100-yard game since 2016. One last stat to throw in, he is at risk of losing his job by the end of the season. So factoring all of those things in, which running back do you want? Running back 1 or running back 2? Well, I'll give you the answer, and it's actually a trick question because they are both Lamar Miller. So it just goes to show you that you can spin a narrative on any player without knowing the complete story. Make sure you're trusting your research, and more importantly, do your own research. That's the only way you're going to know exactly who you're getting. So take everything you hear with a grain of salt and use multiple resources when doing your draft preparation. Don't buy into all the hype. Moving on to item number 3, we have not factoring in ADP when making your rankings or your draft selections. And this one is very simple, and to explain it further, having a player ranked as wide receiver 10 does not mean that you need to draft them at wide receiver 10. If the current ADP of a player is going as, let's say, wide receiver 24, it's possible that you can likely wait on that player an entire round before even considering drafting him. So even if you have a player ranked significantly higher than his ADP, does not mean you need to pull the trigger as early as possible. possible. In fact, the longer that you wait, the more expected value you gain from taking that player. Remember, the goal in fantasy is always to take the best player that is available as late as humanly possible. So if you can consistently find values at every stage of the draft, you're going to be leaving happy with your team, and the quickest and easiest way to do that is to understand exactly where these players are going, take them as late as possible, and at the best deal you possibly can get them at. Item 4, moving on, we have not following your rankings, and it could possibly be the most common mistake I see year over year. We all know emotions run high on fantasy draft day, and when we see players fall past their ADP, we tell ourselves it's almost impossible to pass up on that type of a deal. What this does is it forces a lot of people to take players that they're not necessarily high on, and the answer is simple. It's just because the ADP says that they're a good value. I mentioned how important knowing ADP is, but remember, you have to use your rankings more than anything. In reality, those players who are falling usually have a reason for falling, so you have to ask yourself if it's actually that you like the player and that's the reason that you're drafting them, or if you're only liking them because they're supposed to go around earlier and they're just sitting there for you and you know you won't have a chance to get them next round. So like I said, always stick to your rankings. We have our premium rankings available, which are completely customizable to adjust. So that's what we recommend. You can just print those out, bring those to your actual draft day, and don't be that guy that gets caught taking players that you're not high on just because you think you're supposed to. Item number 5, not checking injuries prior to the draft. Now, don't be that guy that completely wastes a pick because they didn't spend 2 minutes to check the injury news on Roto World before the draft. If Roto World is too complicated for you, just go to Twitter. Every injury there is completely spammed, and usually we know right away if it's something that we have to be worried about or not. Now, most drafts are during the weekend where we have games, and if you're not keeping up with injuries, you could potentially miss out on a very valuable pick by drafting a guy who's injured. Unlike live drafts, online drafts don't usually have a pause button, so if you are one to draft an injured player, nobody is going to give you a second chance to just completely throw out that pick and take another player. It happened over the weekend in one of my leagues. A guy there drafted Marquise Lee, and he should consider himself lucky because that injury wasn't to an early round pick. But ask anyone who drafted Jordy Nelson a few years back how easy it was to lose out on one of those borderline first, second round talents and still try to compete with the 11 other teams. It's not easy, and it can really put a bad taste in your mouth to start the season, and it's super simple to avoid. We all have smartphones. Let's put them to good use. Item number 6, sticking to a specific strategy. Now, this is definitely a mistake. We all love RB0, and heck, wide receiver 0 seems like something that could be completely possible this season as well, but regardless of how good each strategy is or sounds, there is never a reason to have to fully commit to one prior to the draft. Now, don't get me wrong, you could completely have an idea of who you want to target and what position groups you want to target at each stage of the draft. That's fine, but at the end of the day, you need to be drafting based on value. As for an example, for this season, running backs are being drafted heavily in the first round, and we do agree it would be wise to snag one in the first round, but if you are at pick 10 and you have a choice between Antonio Brown or Kareem Hunt, just go with Antonio Brown and take the rusher in the second round. For another example, we always say don't take a quarterback early, and believe us, we do stand by that 100%, but at a certain point, if the top tier quarterbacks are falling to the 6th, 7th, 8th round, there is a point in which the value is too immense to pass up. In an experts league that I did last month, Aaron Rodgers went at the back of the 6th round. I don't care what anyone says, that's a great pick. In the 3rd, the 4th round, no way. But in the 6th round, especially the back of the 6th round, I'll take that all day. Unfortunately, I wasn't the one that landed him, but I do have to applaud the guy that did. And long story short, don't tell yourself you have to draft this position group no matter what. If there's something that just falls into your lap, don't be afraid to pull the trigger. Mistake number 7, picking safe late round picks. And this one just completely baffles me because why is anyone taking guaranteed points in the later rounds? You're not going to be starting these players, so what's the value of a guaranteed 6 bench points? Newsflash, bench points, they don't count towards your weekly totals. And also, those types of players who are putting up safe and consistent low points week over week are typically the guys who are the hardest to drop. And it's not like you plan on starting them anyway. If you do have to start them, you never feel good about it. So we always recommend with every late round pick, you always want to draft a guy with the potential to be a top 20 player at the position. What that entails is knowing the range of outcomes of that player. So understanding the depth chart, maybe an injury that could happen to a player around him, or just a player that generally has a lot of unknowns that need to fall in their favor in order to be a productive producer. Those guys with the most question marks, those are the guys that you want to target, and those are the guys that end up having the most upside. They also have a 0 floor, which is completely fine. We don't care about the floor. It could be extremely low. Remember, you should always feel comfortable dropping these players if the situation that you see could potentially happen just isn't panning out. And it's going to be a low percentage success rate. But when you hit big. And some of the safe floor players that we would avoid, for example, are someone like Sterling Shepard, Theo Riddick, or Cameron Meredith. Some of these higher upside, low floor players are players like Anthony Miller, John Brown, and Tyler Lockett. Moving on to mistake number 8, drafting too many players on the same team. Now, this strategy, it does work in DFS because there are going to be games during the season where you have someone like Phillip Rivers, Mike Williams, and let's say Keenan Allen on the same roster. It is possible that maybe 1 or 2 weeks out of the season, Rivers throws potentially 2 touchdowns to Keenan Allen and maybe 1 to Mike Williams. So in total, in your DFS lineup, you have approximately 6 touchdowns on your whole roster, which is great, but just keep in mind, that doesn't happen often. There are also going to be several games, in fact, way more games, where the variance is not going to fall in your favor and Gordon's going to rush in for 2, and the only touchdown that Rivers throws is going to be to a random player like Travis Benjamin. So when you draft too many players on one team, especially in the passing game, you're going to have a lot of variance. Receivers on their own have a lot of variance week over week anyway. So to minimize that point fluctuation, you want to diversify the players and the teams that you are having investments in. The goal is to have a safe baseline of points with that game-breaking upside, and we understand that having a bunch of players on the same team may sound like a good idea in theory, but when it happens and you're in the playoffs and it's win or go home and half your team is up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, you can't feel excited. And you know you could legitimately score 70 points in total and have no shot at winning the championship. And winning the championship, that's what it's all about. We're not just about making it to the playoffs. If you want to win that money, we want the best team with the most upside that still has the week-to-week consistency to beat out those easier teams. But if variance goes your way, you can beat out some of the strongest teams in the league. Now that's the goal. To attain that goal, you got to diversify your roster. It's as simple as that. Mistake number 9 is being a homer or avoiding players on teams that you don't like. Now I'll start off by saying this. I am an Eagles fan, and in my highest paid money league, I drafted Ezekiel Elliott first overall. Now it's a standard league, and I have Zeke ranked first overall in standard, so it shouldn't really be too much of a surprise, but as an Eagles fan, that may be weird to see. Why would I want to root for Ezekiel Elliott? The truth is, no matter how much it's going to pay me to root for him, I just want the points. I want to win, and you got to separate your emotions from the fantasy football community. If you pass up on players for the uniform that they wear, or you overpay for players that are on your favorite team, it's an easy way to start the season at a severe disadvantage. We of course aren't avoiding players that we like, just consider it a bonus if you end up with that player on your favorite team, and don't go out of your way to target them around in advance just because you want to root for them on Sunday. If you really want to root for that player with your team on your fantasy roster, just play DraftKings and do some sort of super stack I was talking about with Rivers. Just have the quarterback, the running back, and maybe a wide receiver on that, and just watch the points stack up and maybe win some money doing it. But don't risk your entire season on having too many players on your favorite team. It's too much risk, and don't avoid players on teams you don't like. Just take the value that's given to you. This last item is definitely one that I hate seeing all the time, and it's number 10. Making trades before the season even starts. And like I said, this one bugs me so much. People are trading before the season even starts, after their draft has taken place. Listen, there should be no reason you're trading if we haven't even seen them play their first game. Players' values are still determined by their ADP, and the only way you're going to get a good deal is if you're taking advantage of somebody new or less experienced. And yeah, maybe you say it's fun because you end up with someone like David Johnson and a Le'Veon Bell combo after a few trades. But is that really what you want to do? I mean, I guess you maybe made the right decision. You have a strong starting roster, but you likely either mortgaged your entire depth, or you took advantage, like I said, of one of those weaker players. And I don't know which situation is really better. If you ask me, I'd say neither of them. On one hand, one season-ending injury to either, in this case, let's say David Johnson or Le'Veon Bell, your team is left with a handful of mediocre players. Meanwhile, that team that you took full advantage of is left with no game-breaking upside because you basically stole their first overall pick. So if you break it down to its finest, what you did in one trade is potentially turned your competitive 12-team league into a busted 10-team league before the season even started. And I'll tell you what, if it was my commissioner that made a wonky trade, I would want to leave the league immediately, and I would not be coming back next year. We all want to be competitive. Just wait till the season starts. I know we're so excited for fantasy football, but don't make trades right now, guys. It makes no sense. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for today's video. It should have been a quick one. I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to sign up for the giveaway. Follow both Nick and I on Twitter. Subscribe to the channel, and you get an extra entry for signing up for our DraftKings deal.